Hello, I hope everybody is doing well. I hope you have this week's readings with you to help us go over our text and to dive into it a little deeper. Our Old Testament reading starts with Isaiah chapter 58 verses 1 through 9. And what you should be thinking about in this passage is, why do you fast? Okay. So after their exile to Babylon, for 70 years Israel would fast at least twice a year, commemorating the fact that they had lost their home and their king. They fasted and prayed, seeking a response, an answer to their troubles. But their prayers have gone unanswered. They felt as if they are in darkness. God has been silent. In verse 3, they asked God if he hadn't noticed their fasting. Although they believe they are seeking God through their fast, they had forgotten that earlier Isaiah had instructed them to seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan and the widow. To truly seek the Lord is to seek justice and righteousness for the poor and oppressed. Fasting is an attempt to align one's priorities to the will of God. Did you catch that? Fasting is an attempt to align one's priorities to the will of God. Fasting, when done properly, is not a means of earning favor from God. It is a means of spiritual transformation. In our reading, Isaiah is calling for a fast, but not from food, but from affluence, indifference, and privilege, so that the community of faith might live in harmony with God, along with those who are humble in spirit. Look at what God says in verses 6 through 7. Is not this the fast that I chose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? But by following God's will, we read in verse 8, then your light shall break forth in the dawn. And in verse 10, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness. Please try to take note and compare to how our Old Testament reading parallels our gospel lesson when we get to it. Our New Testament reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 and 13 through 16. Corinth is a wealthy, strategic Roman city in southern Greece. In the preceding and following chapters, Paul is addressing division in the Corinth church over several different issues. Though Paul is educated and well-versed in the Greek language, he does not address the church with fancy or persuasive language or as a great orator, something the Greeks would expect and respect. He lets the Lord do his talking. Paul explains to them that he sees everything through the lens of Jesus Christ crucified. It's not what Paul sees, but how he sees. How do we see? Paul tailored his methods and message to draw attention to God's power rather than human wisdom. Human wisdom cannot explain spiritual things. We are unable to grasp by our intellects that which God has prepared for those who love him, the grace and salvation he offers freely. God gives his Spirit to those who come to him in faith, and that Spirit enables the person of faith to understand the gifts bestowed on us by God. These spiritual gifts make it possible to understand God in ways that those who have not received these gifts cannot, or they think these things are foolishness. In verse 13, where Paul speaks of comparing spiritual things with spiritual things, he is saying that those who focus on the spiritual rather than the physical world are those who are equipped to hear spiritual words, to appreciate the gospel, and to receive the Spirit. They are not hard-packed soil, or rocky soil, or thorn-infested soil, but are instead fertile ground. Does this sound familiar to you? His point is, in contrast to the unspiritual person, the spiritual person is equipped to discern, judge, evaluate all things, both spiritual and unspiritual. In verse 16 we end with, "But we have the mind of Christ." The spiritual person, having been reborn by the grace of God, begins to see life from a new perspective. I know I sure have. From Christ's perspective, from Christ's perspective, everything looks different. The mind of Christ is all about service. To the extent that we do have the mind of Christ, we see things from a perspective that make our old values seem irrelevant, and the life of service and devotion the ideal towards which we strive. It may not be that easy, but we should look at everything through the lens of Christ crucified, and let God's wisdom speak through us. I think those of you who are familiar with contemporary Christian music might think of the song Word of God Speak from Mercy Me. And if you want to get more of a definition about wisdom in that, and what God says about wisdom, read James 1 and James 3, and you'll find that quite interesting. Our gospel is found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. And we're probably all familiar with this text about salt and light. Jesus is talking about a life that makes a difference for others in the world. Salt and light are not elements that are useful to themselves. Salt's value comes in its application on other things. Likewise, as followers of Jesus, we are called to exist for others. Light functions to allow humans to see. In Jesus' usage, the light is not simply to allow us to see, but it is for others to witness the acts of justice that Jesus' followers perform. Sound like we're back up in Isaiah. These elements only fulfill their purpose when they are used, but both sustain life. In today's age, it's hard for us to imagine the impact of Jesus' words, but both elements were so important for sustaining life back then. And darkness was truly darkness. There were no light switches, no lights, no generators. When it was dark, it was dark. When Jesus talks about putting a light under a bushel basket, he does not mean that the light is snuffed out, but rather it is rendered ineffective. Think about that. It is rendered ineffective. And the only way for our light to be covered is if we put a bushel over it. Think about these verses from John. For ours is the light of all people. This light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. so let your light shine before others. I found this observation from Amy Oden quite interesting, and I'd like to share it with you. I think it's thought-provoking. Think about the bushels that cover your congregation's light. What are they? Maybe the bushel is an inferiority complex, a lack of confidence that comes from chronically comparing ourselves to the big church across town, or to the good old days when our church was full of children and youth. The inferiority bushel blocks out God's light. Or perhaps the bushel is the self-absorption of internal conflicts. While conflict is an expected part of any human organization, when conflict becomes an excuse for unproductive institutional self-absorption, then it is a bushel that prevents our light from shining. Or perhaps the bushel is the fantasy church in our minds. Unfortunately, for some congregations, our bushels become our very identity. Not only do we put the bushels over our light, but we cling to them for dear life, unwilling to let them go. End of the reading. Something to think about for our church, and how ourselves put bushels over our own light. In verse 17, Jesus lets us know that he has come to fulfill the law. This fulfillment is in the sense of interpreting its meaning for contemporary practice. And in the last verse, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees positively, recognizing the contributions they have made over the years for the Jewish community. He is making the point of how difficult this new obedience is. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, writes, "The Pharisees cultivate harmonious relations with the community and receive respect from the community because of their virtuous lives. Jesus' followers must be," end of quote. So Jesus' followers, we, must be more committed to God's justice in the world than these prominent leaders. So, in summary, who are salt of the earth? They are the humble, the ones who mourn, the meek, and those who thirst after doing what is right in the world. Who are the light? They are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who receive persecution for standing up for what is right. I hope you find this message thought-provoking and useful. Be blessed.